Good evening, class. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about competitive advantage, culture, strategic leadership, uh, concepts that the authors have developed and put forth in chapter 12. But before we do that, we want to just go back to chapter 12, chapter 11, where talked about bases of power versus, influence tactics, hard power versus soft power, uh, charismatic or, high level of charisma versus transformational leadership, good versus bad. They talked about, Jim Jones as an example of a charismatic leader that, things really went south for the majority of those individuals. And when it comes about transformational leadership, you've got things like inspiration, individualized consideration, um, intellectual stimulation. So trying to get across the concepts of influence. I think they get into some information about missions and visions and missions and visions. They can either be narrow or they can be very broad in scope. And as far as when it comes to mission and especially vision, you want something that's going to be effective for the long haul, but you want it to be extremely bold. You want to grab people's attention. You want people to be energized about it. You want it to be change oriented, reflects high ideals and values. You want it to be possible to attain. I've had some leaders that stand up in front of a group and they start talking, and it's like, oh man, this is not going to happen, and it didn't happen. I mean, they couldn't get anybody to buy into these grandiose ideas, and it was really difficult. Actually a difficult meeting to sit through. And you want it to be shared widely. If you're a leader and you wrote out your mission statement or your vision and where the future's headed, you're talking about a 1 year, 3 year, maybe 5 year kind of vision, strategic plan. You want to be upbeat and you want everybody buying into it, because you as a leader, if you buy into it, then the chances are that your followers are more, there's a higher probability that your followers will buy into it, and they'll start talking it up with other individuals in the company, and the next thing you know, they're actually helping you lead forward. So that's those are kind of some concepts on mission and vision. And then for chapter 12, they're going to get into uh, shaping organizational culture, and I think a lot of leadership seminars I've been to or texts I've read don't spend a lot of time on culture. And you see, culture is extremely important, because culture is really going to drive things like the future and profitability. And I think a lot of seminars or talking heads that think they know a lot about leadership don't talk a lot about culture, simply because it's hard for them to get their arms around it. And lastly, before we kind of jump in here, if you listen to to Fox Business or some of the Wall Street Journal or some of the other business channels or talking heads on the business cycles, you'll hear them talking about I'm buying this, I'm buying this particular stock because either they've got the culture now that they think is going to drive them into the future, or they've just hired a new CEO that developed this great culture at another company, and they think that this CEO is going to come in and change the culture and drive productivity and efficiency going forward for their new company. So culture is extremely important, especially for individuals dabbling in the stock market, or actually even the big players in the stock market. Culture is somewhat of a gauge for a lot of these individuals when they're trying to determine estimates of the future for some of these equity-based companies that they're buying stock on. And the authors start out, they say, overarching goal of strategic leadership is to create competitive advantage. And that does make a lot of sense, especially if you go back to your old micro classes. Competitive advantage, the advantage that a firm creates for itself based on valuable, rare, and not easily imitated and non-substitutable resources. Kind of an odd way to, I guess, to go about making comments about competitive advantage. These authors, it's just a little different definition of competitive advantage. If you go back to, I guess, your old micro classes and look through some of your micro textbooks, microeconomics may define competitive advantage as factors that firms use to produce goods and services better or more cheaply than others being competition. So it can be things like the leadership team, it can be branding, it can be cost structure, it can be profitability, it can be efficiency. And so you have a lot of these factors that are driving the ability to, again, produce goods and services better or more cheaply than competition. And if you can produce it better, especially here, you hear firms talk about customer service. We're number one in customer service. We've got the best customer service. And that kind of entices individuals to invest in that firm because everybody knows that customer service goes a long way in moving a firm forward. And when they talk about resources, if resources, and they say if resources are valuable, because valuable resources improve efficiency and effectiveness. If they're rare, not easily imitated by other firms. And then lastly, if they're non-substitutable or easily replaced. And when talking about that third factor, they're not talking about the rare resources that they talked about in the second factor. They're talking about non-rare resources when they're talking about non-substitutable. Competitive advantage is achieved by organizational culture. Again, listen to a lot of the business shows or, Fox Business, CNN, Wall Street Journal. These guys that I guess are on Saturday and Sunday morning, at least here in Atlanta, I don't know, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And it's kind of like a Wall Street Journal and a Barron's Roundtable. I mean, all of these talking heads on the finance side of the house, and it's not out of the ordinary for them to get into the culture and what the culture of this company is going to do for future sales or future growth in an industry. So organizational culture is extremely important. It's valuable by motivating employees in innovation. Culture is not easily copied, imitated, and the values and beliefs and norms aren't either. So you want a culture that's generated or developed by a very strong strategic leader that is difficult to be copied or imitated by other firms. Culture drives potential value if you have non-substitutable goods. And they talk at one point in the text that training programs should not be viewed as a substitute for culture. I can't remember the last firm I worked for that didn't spend what I thought was an inordinate amount of resources, training and education, because they thought that was going to build the culture. They thought it was going to jumpstart culture. Training and education it's an approach that either complements or supplements culture, but the culture in an organization it's to some extent kind of developed from the top down, because if you have to have a very strong strategic leader to help develop the culture, to lay out the beliefs and the norms for everybody to follow. And if you've got that strong leader, then you have a better opportunity to develop the organizational culture that a firm needs to survive the long haul. The leader's job is to identify, protect, and nurture resources to drive competitive advantage. Again, leaders, especially those at the very top of the food chain in an organization, they're the ones that are going to have to drive and nurture this culture forward. Leaders are going to establish or redirect of a mission, core purpose and a shared vision. So they're going to either develop the mission or they're going to redirect the mission that encompasses their core purpose. And we learned that in chapter 11. And they have to have a shared vision that is shared with everybody in the company. So leaders spend their time formulating strategy, and they spend their time implementing mission, vision, and strategy. And a lot of times, while it's important to bring, especially I'll call them mid-level managers, into the discussion when you're developing mission, vision, strategy, a lot of companies don't. And I've worked for a lot of companies that it was like the mission and the vision and the strategy and the norms and the beliefs of corporate culture. It was like it was developed up on the mountain, and it came down from on high and said, this is going to be the way we're going to do business. And sometimes individuals at some of the lower levels of an organization, especially if you're a huge organization, they're going to have a hard time trying to figure out, because of maybe a lack of communication, just where they fit in the whole process. What is the connection among leadership, culture, and competitive advantage? And then the text is going to start walking us through that. Environmental context, competitive advantage, and organizational culture. So that's the way they're going to try to tie these pieces together. And they talk about strategic leadership, and the definition that they at least propose, it's continuously monitoring and scanning an organization's environmental context for the purpose of determining new trends, threats, and opportunities, all of which can impact competitive advantage. Again, I've worked in healthcare the majority of my professional career. Grew up on a dairy farm, worked economic research service for 3 years, and then ended up going into the healthcare side of the house. And the majority of the time, except for my consulting work I'm doing now, is spent on the health plan side. And just the amount of resources that health plans spend, and I'm sure other companies do too, with their strategic planning departments and competitive advantage reports. And most health plans generate these competitive advantage reports, and a lot of them will generate them on a quarterly basis. They'll do one in Q1, and they'll continue to Q2, Q3, Q4, and kind of keep everybody in sync on where they stand as a company. But significant resources are spent on these competitive advantage reports, because it doesn't matter whether it's healthcare, whether it's Starbucks, whether it's McDonald's, they're all trying through their strategic leadership, trying to secure their place as the 800-pound gorilla in the market. And without information, or without actionable and relevant information, it's really difficult to do that. And they talk about context can be achieved by, there's economic context where you're concerned about profits and loss and balance sheets, income statements, the financial side of the organization. Regulatory, so you've got the context is not on the financial piece of the organization, but it's they're talking about the economic situation in the market or the industry that a firm is functioning in. And then you've got a regulatory. You never know what Uncle Sam's going to do or what a state legislature is going to do. So you've got changing laws and regulations. And then you've got technology. What's it going to do to products and processes and services provided. And when you go back to the three, so you're talking about economics, that's where you usually see this strategic planning come into play. Regulatory, every health plan I've worked for has a group of individuals in the office or in the organization that spends all of their time, scanning the Federal Register, talking to lobbyists, trying to figure out what the next bump in, the regulatory or laws are going to be. So a lot of resources spent there. And then, from a technology perspective, if you've ever been in healthcare, maybe if you've ever been on the technology side of any firm, you have consultants like the Gartner Group that are constantly out there looking at technology and what's this new technology going to do. And working in Buffalo for Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association had a group of individuals that their sole function was trying to figure out what technology was coming down the road that would be available to health plans and to help, individual health plans achieve efficiency, effectiveness, boost their profit margins. So all three of these kind of contextual aspects are resources are just allocated within, at least within the firms that I've worked for in the past, to ensure that the firm is optimizing all three of these. Aspects of environment depends on the nature of business and the customers. When you talk about regulatory, it is a significant player in healthcare market. It's a significant player, and in the healthcare market, both the payer and the provider side of that financial coin in the healthcare market. So regulatory is a significant player there. Significant player in the energy market. Think about fracking. Think about the current issues with oil leases and things like that. So energy is significantly affected, just like healthcare. Technology. Think about electronics. Think about Apple and any of your electronic makers that are concerned about technology. And finally, it's just anything that's impacting the status quo. You've got to understand how changes to resource acquisitions are going to impact the status quo going forward into the future. And one thing that strategic leaders have to do is if there is a cultural gap, they have to identify the cultural gap, and they have to develop values, norms, behaviors. Maybe it's not aligned with the demands of the environment. So you've got to, assess your environment constantly to make sure that there's no culture gaps, or if you're a strategic leader, you've got to understand, well, I may need to change my values or my norms or my behavior within the company, or I'm going to end up being at not a competitive advantage, but a competitive disadvantage. And a competitive disadvantage is where you end up with a difference between the desired culture and the actual behavior. So a strategic leader could have a great strategic plan and understanding of, a strong culture that their firm or their business needs. But if they can't communicate it to the followers, then there's going to be this gap between the desired culture and the actual behavior. And if you've got these gaps, and if you've identified the gaps, whether the strategic leaders identified them or their strategic planning shop has, or somebody in the organization, if they've identified them, they've got to take steps to close these gaps. And when you're, I go back to Buffalo, my Buffalo experience at Blue Cross Blue Shield, they were constantly they were developing a culture that was recognized in the community for doing charitable work, for being involved in community activities, constantly in the news for, working with school programs, working with homeless individuals. So that was a culture that Blue Cross in Buffalo really drove forward, as they wanted to be viewed as the health plan of choice and they wanted to be viewed as health plan of choice because they were there to help the Buffalo community to be a partner with the Buffalo community to ensure that the quality of life for everybody in Buffalo was optimized to its fullest level. Culture and strategic leadership are the difference between competitive advantage and competitive disadvantage. Sometimes you end up with, and especially if I think about the health plans that I work for, so Aetna, United, HealthNet, which is now Centene, but those three health plans especially, you had a lot of, I don't want to say turmoil. You had a lot of changeover in leadership. So it wasn't out of the ordinary to have a change in leadership every couple of 3 years, and every leader came in, had a new culture and a new mission and vision statement that they were pushing. And most of those new leaders coming in, developing that mission, vision, and their culture, they were concerned with the environmental aspects that they were having to deal with. So they were constantly tweaking and fine-tuning, again, the mission and the vision and their approach to developing their culture. Blue Cross Blue Shield in Buffalo brought in a new CEO, I don't know, 2015, 2016, maybe, I can't remember the exact date. And he had a completely different vision, completely different, mission and vision, and wanted to change the culture. And he went a long way in changing the culture. And from my perspective, it certainly changed the culture for the good of the organization, because it'd gotten a little stagnant. And it was time for new leadership, and they brought a new individual in. And again, from my perspective, he implemented what he had learned over the years working in healthcare, and it worked out very well for Blue Cross Blue Shield there in Western New York. And when the authors, they were talking about surveys to different CEOs or different leaders, and what you find is these leaders don't really understand culture. They either don't understand the importance of it, or they don't know how to get their arms around it. They don't know how to develop it. They don't know how to implement it. So it makes it really difficult from a leadership perspective for some of these CEOs. And with that, we're going to stop, and we're going to be back in a few minutes with the second segment. Talk to everybody in a few minutes.